Hey guys, Sean here. Today, looking at our back with another tier list. Today we'll be ranking the best hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! For the January 2025 format. Hand traps have become an unescapable reality of the game, and it's very important to know which hand traps are the best. So let's get right into the tier list. We have a few tiers here. We have
Squid Games, Dimension Shifter, I hardly know her, Dominate These Nuts, and Droll on my bird till I lock.
Let's begin with a very good hand trap. A tried and true, a staple of pretty much every deck. We have Infinite Impermanence. It's just one of those hand traps where you can't go wrong. Just put it into any deck. It's just so good. Activatable from your hand, if you control no cards. Targets one monster on the field, negates its effects. You just can't go wrong. Good for going first, good for going second. Good into pretty much any matchup. There's pretty much no deck that doesn't suffer from this card. And its on-field effect is pretty good as well. Being able to negate a column can be very important. A lot of decks now have effects where they set cards to their field, so continuous spells and traps are very prominent. So the effect of Imperm to be able to negate all cards in a certain column actually is a lot more important now than it might have been in the past. It's not just like, oh, it might happen. It genuinely is an interaction that might come up. Imperm, just a great hand trap. Pretty much can throw it into any deck. The only reason it's not top tier is because it does one thing and it does it well, but it's not as good against certain decks as like other cards. So it's really good as staple, one of the best hand traps in the game, but I do think it belongs in the second tier.
I definitely agree. Second tier with Dimension Shifter, I hardly know her. One thing I really like about it though is the fact that it's a normal trap. If you're going first and your opponent interrupts you and you have triple tactics thrust, what you're able to do is activate thrust and you're able to set that Imperm into your back row if your opponent has no monsters, so you just get an interruption straight into your back row as well. So not only does it work as an interruption by yourself, you can also use it as a disruption by yourself as well.
That's a really good point. It is a trap, so it can't be called by. It's much safer to use than a lot of other hand traps. And again, you can use Triple Tactics Thrust to set this from the deck. So, very versatile, really good card. Next up, we have a very similar card, Effect Veiler. I would put these two cards on par. They do have differences. I do think Imperm is better, but Effect Veiler is really good as well. During your opponent's main phase, you can target one monster your opponent controls and negate its effects. Pretty much the same effect as Imperm. It is more restricted, it is an older card, so it can only be used during your opponent's main phase, which does hurt. It is a bit of a restriction. Now that Tenpai is pretty much gone from the format, this is a much better card to be able to run now. You pretty much would not run this card last format because of Tenpai. Tenpai really did not care about Veiler. But now, it's just, again, another really good card to put in your deck. A really good targeted negation. And a benefit of pretty much all like monster card hand traps is that you can normal summon them and go into something like a Typhon. So that's really good as well. That's something you should keep in mind. Pretty much every monster hand trap can be used for that purpose. So it's not really going to give Effect Veiler an edge, but it is something cool to note that all monster hand traps can be used as like material for something. A while back with Snake Eye, you could use this with your Selene combo, because it is a spellcaster monster, so keep that in mind. There are certain interactions with certain hand traps that are really good, but Veiler's just really good. You just can't go wrong.
It's also a light monster as well, so it's also good if you're playing some Bystials and stuff and you want to like not get rid of all your good stuff in the graveyard. Getting rid of Effect Veiler in the graveyard doesn't affect you too much. That's also a good way to get out some of your monsters. Also, the fact that it's a tuner, it can open up some of your synchro plays as well. If you're open up to that, it doesn't really matter. Just sometimes it can come in handy as well.
Next up, Chaos Hunter. It's pretty much only good because Malice is in the format. You discard a card, special summon it, and while it's on the field, your opponent cannot banish. I do think Lancea is better, and we might as well talk about them at the same time. Lancea is better because you activate it from your hand and it's a lingering effect. So, for the whole turn, your opponent will not be able to banish cards, which is much better in my opinion than your Chaos Hunter, because if Chaos Hunter leaves the field, your opponent will still be able to banish. So I think Lancea beats out in that regard, but they pretty much serve the same purpose. If you're playing a deck that wants to discard cards, Chaos Hunter might be better, and it is a free body, 2500 attack. It's not terrible, but I think Lancea is just a bit better. Quick effect from your hand whenever you want. Stops your opponent from banishing cards. So against decks like Malice, which is the main reason you'd use this card, it is really good. Even some other decks, like I know Branded is not as popular now, but it is really good against Branded. Against other decks as well, it can shut down a lot of things, but it doesn't apply to every matchup. Honestly, if it wasn't for Malice, this card would be way lower because it's just not as applicable, but since it pretty much shuts down the second best deck in the format, it definitely belongs in the mid tier.
The good thing about Chaos Hunter is that it doesn't stop you from banishing cards, it stops your opponent from banishing cards specifically. So if you're going into a Malice mirror match where you guys are both playing Malice, definitely play Chaos Hunter over Lancea, because Lancea is going to shut down both of you, whereas Chaos Hunter is going to only shut down your opponent. Depending on what you're playing, if you're playing a banishing deck, you still want to banish cards, so Chaos Hunter might be a little bit better, but if you're just playing some simple rogue deck and you're going to be facing Malice quite a lot, you definitely want to be playing Lancea.
Next up, we have Droll and Lockbird. It must go in this tier because the tier is named after it. No, it's a good card. Probably something like this. It's very good in combination with a lot of other hand traps. Droll on its own, against certain decks, of course, shuts them down completely. It's pretty good against Bystials. If they have to begin with something like a Bonfire, you can completely cut them off of getting their duo drive searches, which is really, really good. Against Malice, it's not half bad either. The problem is, the best decks in the format right now are not completely shut down by Droll. It's really good, and a lot of rogue decks just completely die to this card. But if you're going against the top meta decks, you will need this card in combination with another hand trap. But that is pretty common in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now. You usually will need 2 or 3 hand traps to stop a combo. At least Droll can completely shut down certain decks, which is really, really good. The existence of this card alone really invalidates a lot of different strategies, so it definitely is very strong. However, Droll does have a unique interaction against the Mulcharmy cards. If your opponent draws off of Mulcharmy, you can use Droll, even on your own turn, which means your opponent will not be able to draw more cards off of their Mulcharmies, which can come up. It's a pretty good interaction if your deck doesn't rely on searching too much, so definitely keep that in mind. I think it's a pretty good card.
I definitely agree, Droll definitely belongs to be in the second tier, might be lower end of the second tier in Dimension Shifter, I hardly know her. Mostly just because I feel like this format is very versatile. I know we do get a lot of Bystials and Malice representation at the very top, but I do think since we're not exactly in a tier 0 format right now, there's going to be a lot of other rogue decks that would be relying on adding a bunch of cards to their hand, so definitely the likes of Droll could just cripple a whole bunch of decks, so I definitely think it deserves a spot really high up in the list. Maybe it won't be exceptionally well against the likes of Malice, but I did see it play a lot against Bystials, so I definitely think it deserves to be high up in the list.
Next up, Nibiru. Nibiru is a good card, of course, you can't argue with that. If your opponent summons more than 5 times, you can tribute all monsters they control and basically wipe their board. So of course a fantastic card against combo decks. Since Barone and Borload and a lot of generic Omni-Negate, such as Apollosa, have all been banned at this point, there's not a lot of decks that can get up a negate before 5 summons, which means that Nibiru is just really good against combo decks. However, in a lot of situations, you will need to pair this with another hand trap, because a lot of decks do have a lot of good recursion. A lot of decks won't be stopped by just one Nibiru, and a lot of decks do have game plans around Nibiru. It's a card that people are going to be playing around because it is very devastating, so a lot of decks are just able to do enough on 4 summons. And because of the Mulcharmies as well, your opponent is really going to be considerate of their summons, regardless of if you have Nibiru or not. So it's in an odd situation there, but it's always been a good card, and combo decks are always going to be prevalent. So I think it goes about there.
I think definitely Nibiru hand in hand with the Mulcharmies is definitely a devastating combo. What I really like about Nibiru this format is that I'm going to be playing Belle a lot, and Nibiru actually complements Belle very well, because if you give your opponent a big token in attack, what you're able to do with Belle is just attack in, then your opponent will take that damage. So Nibiru can be quite complementary to a few decks around like Belle, which is definitely a high rogue sort of deck, so it's definitely one hand trap to look out for in this format.
Next up we have the Bystials. The Bystials are a pretty cool hand trap, very good in certain formats. In this format, however, they're fine. They're pretty good against Belle, and that is going to be a deck that does see a lot more play now with the most recent ban list. It has some application against Bystials and some application against Malice, and it's pretty good against Fiendsmith, to be honest. But they're not the best, but they really need to be played in your deck regardless if you want to make use of them as a hand trap. If you're playing Centurion, it's a great card because it's part of your engine as well as being a hand trap. Even decks like Branded, if you're still playing that. These cards will be used regardless of if they're being used as a hand trap or a part of your engine. So they're really cool in that regard, that you can just run these really powerful cards in your deck, and that sometimes they can be really good against your opponent. But will you be using these cards in a deck that doesn't run the Bystials? It's hard to say. I don't think they're that good into the best meta decks.
I definitely agree. For that reason, I might move them down a little bit. Maybe at the top of Dominate These Nuts will be probably a good spot for them. It's just not the format for them right now. A lot of the top decks can still play through Bystials, no problem at all. The one thing I will make an argument with Bystials, as you said, is that it can run well along with your engines if you're playing something like Centurion or Branded or even Red Dragon Archfiend builds and stuff like that, it can be quite good. But kind of a lot of people are able to play around Bystials now. I know Malice doesn't really care too much about Bystials. In fact, sometimes it can be quite helpful to them. So I don't think that Bystials are the best right now. They're still a great hand trap. Just this format is not the format.
Next up, PSY-Framegear Gamma. Very sad. It's at 1 and you have to run a brick in order to play this card. It's a very good card, but if you have to play one copy and it's unsearchable and you have to play a brick in your deck to use it, it's not great. This card was really good when it was at 3 copies, because you could just run more than 40 cards and your odds of seeing the brick compared to seeing Gamma were really heavily in your favour. But nowadays, it's just not good. You might run this in maybe Dragon Link, but most of the time you probably won't even run this card. Unfortunately, while it's at 1 copy, I don't think this card will be seeing any play. Unless you're also running another PSY-Framegear hand trap, which again is not the most likely thing to happen either.
I definitely agree. If this card wasn't at 1, it might be higher up on the list, especially because it's the hand trap that can like beat hand traps. But I don't know, just considering that it's at 1 and you have to run along with a brick, it's not the best.
Next up, Maxx. Now, if you look at the figures, if you look at the data, Maxx is awful. Nobody runs Maxx. If you look at results from regionals, if you look at results from YCSs, nobody's playing this card in their build. And there's a reason for that. It sucks. No one's going to play this card. It's just really not good. The numbers don't lie. Next up, we have the Mulcharmy monsters. We'll begin with Mulcharmy Purulia. It is good, but probably about here, I'd say. Purulia is a good card. If your opponent normally special summons from the hand, you draw a card. This is really good against certain decks. And even against Raziel, this sees a lot of use because a lot of your Raziel monsters summon from the hand. And it's really cool against decks like Flunder, because unlike Maxx, it says when your opponent normal summons. So considering decks like Flunderee's only normal summon, you'll be getting a ton of draws off this card. Against decks like Sprite as well, Sprite really rely on summoning from the hand, you'll be drawing a lot of cards. However, most decks are able to play around this card pretty well. You're mostly not summoning from the hand, you're mostly summoning from the deck or extra deck. So it does have limitations there. It's not a bad card at all, but I do think it pales in comparison to Mulcharmy Fuwalos, which is probably the best hand trap in the game, if only for the reason that it helps you draw more hand traps, which is quite funny. Fuwalos lets you draw a card when your opponent special summons a monster from the deck or extra deck, which is modern Yu-Gi-Oh! You'll be summoning a lot from the deck or extra deck, and even if your opponent doesn't really want to play into it and they end on a smaller board, you're already drawing like 2 or 3 cards, which can help you draw into more hand traps or into more combo pieces. It's just a really good card. Luckily, the Mulcharmys can only be used as a going second card because they need you to have no cards on your field to activate them. But Mulcharmy Fuwalos is definitely way better than Purulia, and the funny thing is you can just use these both in the same deck, because you're allowed to activate up to 2 Mulcharmy cards in the same turn, which is kind of ridiculous. Insanely good against combo decks. Even if you're playing against a slower kind of stun based strategy, even if you're playing against something like Labyrinths, you're pretty much always going to get at least a draw out of this card, and that's pretty much more than enough. So Fuwalos, one of the best cards Yu-Gi-Oh! Has ever seen.
But I will make an argument, I would probably put the other guy just above Nibiru. I just think that if we're kind of going on with Nibiru needs 5 things to happen in order for you to activate it, whereas with this Mulcharmy, even if you get 1 or 2, maybe even 3 draws, I think that's a little bit better than the possibility of Nibiru. I just think the draws could be a bit more important than Nibiru itself, so I definitely think that should go up a little bit. But yeah, everything you said is perfect. Undoubtedly, Fuwalos is the GOAT of this format. Definitely very good. Only thing is, it is very expensive, so the top players that have no problem buying it would definitely have no problem investing into it. You mightn't see it further down the ladders because a lot of people don't want to be spending like $210 on a playset, which is fair. It's fair enough. I wouldn't do that myself. So it's the good thing about it is getting reprinted hopefully soon enough with that reprint set. So hopefully it might go down and might get a bit more representation. But undoubtedly, goated hand trap. Definitely top tier Squid Games.
And for the final Mulcharmy, we have Mulcharmy Meowls. It is coming out in Supreme Darkness. It is okay. It lets you draw a card if your opponent special summons from the graveyard. While a lot of decks can summon from the graveyard, there are very few meta decks right now that exclusively summon from the grave. So it really is only good against certain matchups. Even decks that might summon a few cards from the grave, for the most part you're better off running your Purulia, because your opponent's more likely to special summon from the hand, and even the normal summon is always from the hand. So you're pretty much always going to get at least some advantage off of Purulia, compared to Meowls, which will really only be good if there's a meta deck that exclusively summons from the grave. It's okay. Next up, Ash Blossom. I genuinely think Ash Blossom is a top tier hand trap. For one, it counters the Mulcharmys, which is very important. Being able to stop card effects that special summon is really, really good. If it only had that effect, it would be used. Later on down the line with Dominus Impulse, Dominus Impulse is pretty much only one effect of Ash Blossom, and it's pretty much played in any deck that can play it. So Ash Blossom just being able to do that whenever, it's just so fantastic. And also being able to stop searches and stop cards being dumped from deck to grave, it's just so versatile, pretty much fits in any deck. There's no deck in the game that cannot be ashed, pretty much. Even stun decks can be ashed with like Pot of Desires and Prosperity and stuff like that. Pretty much every deck in the game is able to be ashed, and it's pretty effective in almost any situation. It's just tried and true, one of the best hand traps in the game. Next up we have Ghost Belle. Ghost Belle is pretty good. It stops your opponent from banishing cards from the grave, special summoning from the grave, and adding cards from the grave to anywhere else. Really, really good card, especially in this format. Really good against Malice, shuts down Bystials, really good against Branded. I know it's not the most popular deck right now, but it is really, really good. Really good against Fiendsmith as well. Definitely has its like use against a lot of matchups. Really good against decks like Labyrinth and stuff like that. But it doesn't do enough. It can stop one thing. There's no decks really right now that rely on like one pivotal graveyard interaction. It stops Bystials, or Bystials are not that important. It can maybe stop one thing that Malice can do. It can maybe stop one Fiendsmith interaction. But on its own, it's not really that good. You really would have to pair it with other hand traps. And even then, you'd probably be better off running some other cards. But it's definitely not bad. It has a lot of scenarios where it can be good, but I don't think it's the best hand trap. But it is versatile and can fit into pretty much any deck, so you can't go wrong with that. It's not bad. Next up, Ghost Ogre. Ghost Ogre was much better last format, with Tempai being at full power. But now I think it's okay. It has some interactions, of course. You can destroy maybe some Raziel monsters. But even then, with the Raziel field spell up, you can just negate it on resolution, which is not great. Even if you try to destroy something like a Duo Drive, it doesn't really help. Your opponent can still combo off. Against Malice, it's not too bad if they try to go for their Cyberse combos. But even then, you'd rather just use a different hand trap. Not terrible against the Malice field spell, but again, just not the best. You probably have better options. It was definitely way better last format, but I just think this format, it doesn't come up as much, and it's not as impactful as being able to pop something like a Sanguine Summoning. So I think it goes about there. It's not terrible, but it's not the best hand trap this format. Next up, Ghost Mourner. Ghost Mourner is not bad at all. Ghost Mourner, I'd say, is similar to your Effect Veiler and your Nibiru, but I don't think it's as good. Basically, on the special summon of a monster, you can target it to negate its effects, and it can also burn your opponent if that monster leaves the field, which can come up in time. It is something to keep note of. But for the most part, it is kind of a worse version of your Veiler and your Imperm. And of course, that's not a bad thing, really. If you want to use it, you're basically just using it as a third copy of your Veiler and your Imperm, which is still really, really good. Target negation is really good. But again, it's kind of a little bit more restrictive. You can't use it at any point. It has to be used on the summon of a monster. So you can't wait for your opponent to use an effect of a monster. It's not really a hand trap you'd want to run on its own. You really need to pair this with other hand traps. So it's kind of like the extra copy of a certain hand trap you want. It's not really the main hand trap you're running, but it's not bad.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It doesn't have as much versatility as the likes of Imperm or Effect Veiler. It can still be really good a lot of the times because a lot of people expect this hand trap to come up, especially if your opponent is playing the likes of Crossout Designator. Not many people run Moonlit Chill in their main deck to Crossout Designator it. They're mostly running Effect Veilers and Imperms to Crossout Designators, so this could be a fun little surprise that can catch them off guard, but it's just not quite as good as the other two.
Next up we have Ghost Reaper. I've been seeing this in a few side decks in like Raziel builds. Raziel is getting close to maybe being tier 0. And of course, if you're playing Raziel, you will be seeing a lot of Raziel mirror matches. And in that case, Spirit Reaper is fantastic. But I don't know. It's only good if you're playing Raziel, pretty much. If you're not playing Raziel, or if you're not playing cards in your extra deck that Raziel also play, it doesn't really do anything. You have to build your deck specifically around this card. Not that it's bad, it's definitely very, very good, but it's kind of a gamble. Maybe at like the top YCS level, if you think everyone's going to be on some Fiendsmith Raziel stuff, it might be a good option. But in that case, you're almost better off running cards like Metaltronus. It's not a bad card, but I think it's a little bit gimmicky. It really does pay off, but it is a bit of a gamble.
I definitely agree. We're not exactly in a tier 0 format, so you're not going to be seeing this as much as you would in the likes of tier 0, where everyone's pretty much playing the same deck, and then everyone's kind of just like using this card in order to get rid of some important extra deck monsters. It's just not the case. Pretty much if you were playing this and you're going against a lot of different road decks, the most you're probably going to get benefit off this is get rid of their IP Masquerena or SP Little Knight, but that can kind of like mess you up a little bit as well. So I definitely think it is, although it is a good card, you're probably only going to be seeing this in the likes of mirror matches, so it's a good side deck option, but I wouldn't be main decking this card at all.
Next up, Spooky Dogwood. It's kind of a gimmicky card, you know, you can just win in time with this card. It kind of has the Mulcharmy effect where it stops your opponent from wanting to summon, because the more they summon, the more life points you get, and if it's coming close to time, you're just not going to win. I don't exactly know how relevant time is this format. The deck seems to be fast enough, but of course at a big event, time will come into play. It is more applicable to side decks than cards like your Ghost Reaper, but again, it's literally just a card you side in at the very end of a match, trying to win in time. Otherwise it has no real application. It's alright. Next up, Dominus Purge. It is not a bad card at all, probably about here. It's a pretty good card, you can't argue with that. However, the restrictions are pretty bad. Once you activate this card, you can't use the effect of Dark, Water, and Fire monsters for the rest of the duel, which turns off a lot of hand traps, specifically Ash. However, it's only after this card's been activated, so you can use stuff like your Ash beforehand, and then use this card, so it's not bad at all. What it does is it stops your opponent from adding a card from your deck to their hand, so basically one of the effects of Ash on a trap, and it also can destroy that card, which is really, really cool. However, it is really restricted. It cannot fit in every deck by no means. Considering how prevalent dark monsters are, you just cannot run this card in a dark deck. Ignoring the hand trap limitation, dark decks just cannot run this card. So that is something you need to consider, but it is a pretty damn good card, but I do think maybe it belongs like maybe about here. It's good, but not the most applicable to every deck.
I definitely agree. It seems like a lot of restriction just to stop your opponent from adding the card from deck to hand. Considering that Ash can just do that like no problem at all. And considering that this does shut you off from a lot of like very, very powerful cards. Like the top decks like Malice are of course a lot of dark monsters. So they're not going to be playing this card. It's going to affect them too much. You're not able to play Ash Blossom after that. It locks you out of a lot. It needs to be a specific type of deck that will be playing this card. It just depends on what you're tailored to. I don't really think it's going to be as powerful as the like of getting Ash and stuff like that. I don't know. I don't think it's as good of a card. I think it might be a little bit overhyped. It just locks you out so much. I just don't think it's the best.
The only exception really is decks like Fiendsmith. All light monsters, so you're pretty much safe to run it in a deck like that. But then you have to consider the hand trap limitation. So it's alright. It's not bad at all, but it is really restrictive and only can be used in certain decks. Next up, Dominus Impulse. Definitely just power crept Dominus Purge. It negates the effect of a card that would special summon a monster, which is just insanely good. That's probably the best effect of Ash right there, and it's just on a trap. And the card types it locks you out of are not nearly as restrictive as Dominus Purge. Stops you from using Light, Earth, and Wind, which, yeah, it stops cards like Veiler and Droll, but it doesn't really stop many decks. So many cards in this game special summon, so being able to just negate that is really, really good. In combination with Ash and stuff like that, it's just so, so good. Of course it has restrictions, but the restrictions are way less worse than cards like Dominus Purge, so I think it belongs very, very high up there. Next up, Meister. It's just not that good. I mean, even Meowls is pretty better. Negates a card effect that activates in the grave. It's not bad at all. A lot of card effects activate in the grave, but it's the only thing it does. It's not like cards like Ghost Belle where it can stop a lot of different things. Cards like Ash. It just does the one thing, and it's only okay at doing that. Even during tier format, where that would be the peak time to use this card, it wasn't really seeing play. It's only okay.
Yeah, you know, it's just stopping one effect in the graveyard. It's not even a lingering effect like the likes of Necrobat or something like that, where you're kind of like restricting the graveyard a lot. It just stops the one sort of thing. This card is just kind of like a weaker version of the likes of your Ghost Belle. It's not the best. It's still a fine card, but yeah, definitely just not the format right now.
Next up, DD Crow. I think DD Crow is really, really good. I think it's pretty slept on, to be honest. Banishes any card from your opponent's graveyard. Unlike your Bystials, which you only banish light or dark monsters, DD Crow can banish any card in your opponent's grave, so monster, spell, or trap. And a lot of spells and traps in the grave have effects in the grave where they can banish themselves to do some crazy stuff. So having a DD Crow can be really, really good against certain matchups. Not the best against decks like Malice, but against Ryziel it can be pretty decent. But it's just good against pretty much every other deck. Fiendsmith really does not want to lose some key pieces in the grave. Really good against Belle, although you probably want to run Bystials against Belle. having Diddy Crow is still really, really good. Against decks like Voiceless, even Labyrinth, it's just nice to be able to take certain cards out of your opponent's grave. But again, it's not one of your main hand traps you want to run. You'll be running this alongside other hand traps to stop certain combos. It's not going to win you the game on its own, but it can be very, very important against certain matchups. So I think it goes about there. Maybe we can put Nibiru above it, but I still think it's really, really good.
Oh really? I was going to go the opposite direction. I was actually going to say it's a little bit better than Moonlit Chill. Just because in Moonlit Chill you need to actually do it when the monster is special summoned. DD Crow you kind of hold back on a little bit. And just considering the prevalence of a lot of cards doing more than just one thing and cards having like a secondary effect in the graveyard, if you really don't want your opponent like popping off with more stuff that they're able to do, I think DD Crow is really, really good for that. So I think DD Crow might be a little bit slept on, but I do think that it might actually come in handy as well. I think considering that your graveyard is pretty much your second hand, it can still do a lot of damage. So I definitely think DD Crow deserves kind of like in the middle, maybe high end of Dimension Shift or Hardly Knower.
Next up, PSY-Framegear Epsilon. It's not bad. It's essentially the same thing as your PSY-Framegear Gamma, except it negates a spell card effect. And this card's at 3, so you're able to run this at 3 copies with 1 driver. So you're going to see this card more than you're going to see your driver. Again, a lot better last format with like Tempai in the meta. Being able to stop the Sanguine Summoning was so important. It's definitely not bad, but I feel like a lot of spells now are not as important to the best decks. Malice and Ryziel, they do use some spells, but they're not that important for their combos. They mainly use monster effects for their combos. Not the best against Fiendsmith either. It's only okay. However, an advantage of running this card is that you can run it alongside a Gamma. Then you'll have 1 Gamma, 3 Epsilon, and 1 driver. So the ratios do work out a lot better that way. So you can say if you want to run Gamma, you can run Epsilon. But for the most part, it's not the most impactful. It is cool. Not many cards specifically negate spell cards. So it is unique in that aspect. And I think its day will come where it's one of the best hand traps in the game. Because spells are just that good. I do think it has a lot of potential and a lot of room to see a lot of play. But right now, I think it's only okay.
Yeah, definitely really good. Spell negation is very few and far between in the game, so having a card that's able to just straight up negate a spell card is really, really good. Considering that it doesn't need to be something like Ash where it's like negating a special summon or negating an ad or something like that. This just full on negates a spell and any spell like that. It is very good, but it's definitely more for like the likes of maybe a going second deck or something like that where you need to be controlling no cards in order to negate it. But still, a spell negation is no laughing matter. I do think it is still very, very good.
Next up, Phantazmay. I'm thinking maybe about here. Snake Eye is no longer the best deck, and Snake Eye was pretty much just a link deck. Raziel, of course, focused on XZs. Malice does link a lot, so it's not bad in that matchup, but why would you run your Phantazmay over something like Chaos Hunter or Lancea in that matchup? Even against stuff like Fiendsmith, it's not the best. You can get some advantage off it, but for the most part, it's only okay. At this point, it's pretty much a worse like Mulcharmy. The whole point of this card is just to get you more draws, and the Mulcharmies pretty much do that on their own anyway. So very much kind of power crept by the Mulcharmies in that way. It can be good maybe in a dragon deck. It could be good with your Impulse because it's a hand trap you can run because it is a dark. So maybe you'd want to run that because you can't run your Fuwalos in combination with your Impulse. It is something to consider, but for the most part it's not really the meta for it, especially since a lot of the best decks are not really entirely focused on link monsters. And finally we have Dimension Shifter. Definitely a very, very good card. Shifter's always been pretty damn good. Really good in Malice because Malice's whole gimmick is banishing cards, so you can just main deck it. Even decks like Flunder and decks like Ritual Beast, they are seeing a fair bit of play. So definitely a card you can put into like a good few decks. Pretty good against Raziel. Really good to use in Malice. And pretty good against decks like Fiendsmith and Belle and stuff like that. Being able to banish a bunch of cards is just so good. However, in a similar fashion to your like Dominus cards, it does take a certain deck to be able to use this. Of course, it does affect you as well. So unless you're playing a deck like Flunder and Ritual Beast or Malice, where you do get advantage off of this card, it can be a bit tricky to use, but for the most part I think the pros outweigh the cons. Shutting down your opponent's turn is a lot more important than it restricting your own turn, so I think it's really, really good. If your deck can play it, that's fantastic, and even if it doesn't fully complement your deck, it can definitely still see play in a lot of decks, so I definitely think it's about there on the tier list.
Yeah, I do think it belongs quite high on the list, but you can make an argument for either or. What I think though is, considering that you are kind of in the format now where it is a lot more versatile, you will be seeing a lot of rogue decks again, so maybe it can cripple a lot more decks than like we can think of right now. I know a lot of the decks, such as like Kashtira and like Malice and stuff like that, they can still play through it, no problem at all. They don't really care too much, although it does cripple them a little bit. I still think Shifter is a very, very good card, but definitely just be on the high end, but I can understand the arguments and why we would keep it kind of like in the high end of Dimension Shifter. I hardly know her.
Alright, so that's it for the tier list. Let us know what you think in the comments. I think this is fair enough. Of course, the meta might shift a little bit from now going into the new year, but I think this is a fairly good overview of the best hand traps in the game for the January 2025 format. Things might shape up near the end of January with Supreme Darkness, so I'm definitely excited to see that. But let us know what you think in the comments. Maybe you think we put a hand trap too high or too low. We'd love to know what you think. If you want to support the channel, we do have memberships, so if you want to see our videos as soon as they come out, you can become a member. And if you want to buy any of these hand traps, you can use our TCG Player affiliate link in the description. If you buy cards using that link, it directly supports the channel and helps us keep up the content. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more tier lists.